One. So we're going to have a panel discussion. This is a great opportunity to hear from some of our leaders about how the deacon secures the invitation to preach. That's sometimes a challenge we have heard in some congregations, even in some dioceses, although I don't think it's a challenge in New Jersey. But we have three perspectives we can hear from. We're going to hear from a deacon. We're going to hear from a priest who was a deacon, and we'll hear from a bishop as well. And like I said, the topic is how the deacon secures an invitation to preach. And I think since we're talking about deacons, we'll start with Tracy Middleton, and then we'll move on to Maria Sanzo, and finally hear from Bishop Stokes as well. So we'll get a little view from the whole church about what this is like. So Tracy, if you would like to join us and fill us in a little bit.
Sure. Thank you, Stephen. I appreciate that. And it's a good topic, and I'm glad to be able to visit with you all today. So, I guess the first and most obvious thing would be, to ask to preach. If that's not currently something that you're doing or not doing, or you're doing it very, very infrequently. So, obviously the canons do say that you're acting under the authority of the minister that's in charge of that congregation. So, but it's obviously it's not just like, I do what I want, I say what I want, but, just, ask. So, but if you or your rector kind of needs some persuasive content as to why that would be an appropriate thing for a deacon to do, we can always look at biblical precedents. Stephen is a pretty obvious one. So he had a very, very long sermon in Acts. And so, but also another person that you may not have thought of, and I wasn't really very familiar with until after I'd been a deacon for a little while, is Phoebe, the deacon from Syncrea. And she is mentioned in Romans, and there was a professor from Baylor University, Beverly Gaventa, who had written a book called When in Romans, and she was kind of talking about Phoebe and how it's not just like, hey, say hi to Phoebe, who's bringing you this letter, she's very nice. The fact that Phoebe brought the letter to the church in Rome meant that she would read the letter, but she would also interpret it to them. And so certainly that is a responsibility and a work of proclamation and also interpretation. And so, that's a pretty good precedent. So in the Book of Common Prayer, obviously we've talked, mentioned the examination, and we're to make Christ and his love known by our word and in the context of worship. And we're also to assist the bishops and priests in ministration of God's word. And our life and teaching are to show Christ's people that in serving the helpless, we're serving Christ himself. And so those kind of phrases indicate that preaching would be an appropriate way to accomplish those parts of the charge. And in the catechism, we also kind of read that the deacon's role is to assist bishops and priests in proclaiming the gospel. And so preaching is certainly one way of doing that. So another thing that I just kind of wanted to mention is the idea of balance between the showing and the telling aspects of your proclamation and service as a deacon. So I kind of think of preaching as one of the telling aspects, and some of the other works as showing. And I also think of like the proclamation of the gospel itself, the reading of the gospel is where all the work that you do normally becomes a commentary on the text that you're reading. And if your life is matching up with what you're reading, then it's a good commentary. And so that's another way that the fact that the deacon reads the gospel is a not insignificant part of what that role entails. So there's a lot of typical types of schedules that might work for people who are non-stipendiary or people who are part-time. So like once a month or once every 6 weeks or maybe once a quarter. I currently preach on sometime in every month that has 5 Sundays. So yeah, from the Archdeacon in Northwest Texas, Chris Rampelmeyer. Now that works well for me. So another thing that I just want to mention is the collaborative kind of nature. And what I would say there is my spiritual director, her name was Janet Davis, it still is. She kind of mentioned to me the idea of this archetypal imagery in literature of the archetype of the prophet and the archetype of the king. And so I kind of think of the prophet as having kind of a responsibility for paying attention to justice, and the king as having a responsibility for paying attention to peace. But if you have peace without justice, then I think that's an example of the kind of coercive silence that Bishop Stokes was mentioning earlier. So sometimes, like he was saying, the deacon is called on to speak prophetically, and that is an aspect of the call. But you don't want to just use your sort of the deacon's prophetic voice as an excuse to be a jerk, right? Or to just stand up and bully people or shake your finger at them and try to make them feel bad. There needs to be compassion in that, and also collaboration. So sometimes it's a good idea, if you're going to say something that's particularly like ruffling of the feathers, to give a heads up to the priest, so that maybe even have a conversation about it, so that they can kind of have some way of, have some input, first of all, and also have some way of kind of preparing for what the backlash might be. Because even if people are mad at what you say, they're not as likely to tell you about it as they are to triangulate and talk to the rector. And so if you surprise them with something like that, they could, if they are prepared, they are less likely to panic and throw you under the bus. So that's, just a tip, right? Pro tip. So then the other thing that I would just say is to continue to work on improving and developing your style and getting comfortable in the way that you speak, and also the styles that work best for your context. So sometimes a more explanatory style fits with a particular group, or a more storytelling style might fit in another context. So, just kind of become versatile in different ways of speaking and different ways of preaching. And this is a really great opportunity to take advantage of, a way to learn more. So thank you for listening, and I'll turn it over to the next person.
Thank you. So securing the opportunity to preach, but in my diaconal days, I was very, very fortunate to work with priests who honored the order and considered me to be a partner in the gospel. And from day one, we established a plan, and normally it was the third Sunday of every month that I would preach. So I knew in advance when would be my preaching Sunday, and I didn't have to question what was going to happen, except for the day that my priest lost her voice. And then I was sort of thrown into it kind of last minute, but what St. Francis says, preach, pray, and die. So, I stood up and did what had to be done. But I think, as a priest, I've taken all of that wonderful stuff that I got as a deacon and try whenever on the rare occasions when I've had an opportunity to work with the deacon, and it really was only as an intern and when they were interning with me, I just always considered them to be my partner in the gospel, and invited them to be in the pulpit if that's what they felt called to do. Some people, preaching is not their thing and they don't want to do it, so I didn't force it upon them. I allowed them to make those decisions for themselves. Most deacons are willing to preach from time to time, but it's really, I like to leave it up to them. I will say that when they did preach, it was always wonderful. Not because I got a Sunday that I didn't have to, but because what they said was amazing and a perspective that I was not able to offer at that point in my life. But I don't know if I can do this because I'm not a techie, but I would love to share the screen, because from another perspective, I wanted to show you some numbers that I encountered when I was working on my doctorate. And let me just say, the reason why I went down this road when I was working on my doctorate for ministry was because I do honor deacons, and I do believe that they need to be brought to the fore. And so the Spirit led me down this road to shine the light on the deacons of the Diocese of New Jersey. But there's a couple of things that came out of the project that may interest you. And if I could pull this off, great. Can everybody see that graph? Yay. Okay. So it's a very simple graph. What it shows is so there were 11 deacons in my project. I call them the Magnificent 11 because they committed an awful lot of time to help me with this. So out of 11 deacons, this is a quick glance of what I learned. Out of the 11 at the time, 7 of them were working without a priest. Pretty amazing. 9 of them believed that priests preach differently than deacons. And of course, that was the whole point of the project. Does a deacon preach differently than a priest? And if so, why? And one of the reasons these 9 gave for their belief that priests preach differently is because they believed that priests were better trained in scriptural study. And therefore they came into the pulpit with a different skill set. And so they brought that into the pulpit in a way that they didn't feel that they were able to do. The next thing that I wanted to point out was preach from the experience of diaconal ministry, and 9 of them believed that they did that on a routine basis. Yay, that's what we hope for, is that they will bring their experiences as a deacon into the pulpit, because that's what the congregation needs to hear. And then this is a really interesting little ditty here. 4 of them, the deacons, changed their preaching in the absence of a priest. So there were 4 deacons who, for a time, worked with a priest and then found themselves working without a priest, and they changed their style of preaching in the absence of a priest because they felt as though they needed to do their whole ministry changed, that they felt as though they needed to keep the congregation together, keep the community together, deal more with pastoral care, all of the priestly things. So they sort of took on the role of the priest in the pulpit. 4 of them did that. And I always have said from day one, deacons are chameleons. They change according to their environment, and that's what makes them so wonderful. And these 4 deacons actually did that in the case of the absence of a priest. And then you'll be happy to know that all of the deacons experienced some level of transformation. Well, that's because they got together and talked to one another. And there are deacons who, almost all of them, desired some kind of a diocesan organization program where they can continue the conversation. And I think that's a thumbs up for what we're doing here in this conference, because deacons yearn to be together. They want to live in community, talk to one another about their ministries, and this is one really good avenue for them to do that. So that's the data that I collected at a very fast, quick glance of what I learned in the project that I did. But I'll just say that, the most important thing is the invitation. I mean, Tracy said that first, and I'm going to join the choir and echo that song, that deacons need to be encouraged and invited to preach, because I think they have a perspective that we need to hear. Thank you.
Thank
So
you.
I appreciate both of those perspectives a lot. And I want to first of all appreciate and support what Tracy said about making sure that, especially if you're going to say something that's particularly challenging, that you do consult the priest in charge before you do it. I recognized I was an associate for 8.5 years in 2 separate places before I was a rector of a parish. And I can assure you being the associate was a lot easier than being the rector. And I could say things and do things as the associate that the rector had a much more difficult time saying and or doing. And it's precisely along these lines. I could say something more controversial and they say, well, he's the curate, I don't mean to be dismissed and to be flip about that, but it is in fact true. And people do go to the rector and want to, I'm kind of back in the associate's position now because I can say and do things as bishop and they say, well, that's just the bishop, and that happens. I'm well aware of it. It gives me a little bit more freedom, but I think it is important to be in that conversation and it's not that you're asking for permission, but you just want to make sure that they don't get caught by surprise because you want them to certainly be supportive of you from the pulpit. My basic expectation is that deacons have preaching responsibilities, and in my ministry as a parish priest, every church I worked in, the deacons preached at least once a month. So when I was the associate, I was preaching once a month. It was a similar schedule. The rector preached twice a month, and then in between, the associate went and a deacon went. That's my expectation. In the Diocese of New Jersey, we're being much more aggressive in our use of deacons, and some of our deacons are preaching weekly. They're being compensated too for that. To me, it is, and I think we basically, I should have checked, but I think our letters of agreement, in fact, include what the preaching responsibilities are going to be for the deacons. That's all set out ahead of time. I see heads nodding from some of my deacons. So I don't have a whole lot more to add than that. It is good, I guess, to say, get that arrangement up front. Mm-hmm. Just expect it to work out. That's why letters of agreement are always a good thing, because you can set out those. And and frankly, if you're a deacon and you want to preach and you end up in a situation where the rector, the priest in charge, isn't open to that, then maybe you want to say, this might not be my call.
That's a good point. Well, at this point, do the panelists have anything they want to say to each other before we open it up to questions and comments from the group at large?
Well, I just want to thank Maria for sharing her data, because that was really interesting. Mm-hmm. I think, whenever there's a chance to kind of do some study and data collection analysis about these kinds of questions, it's really valuable.
I'll let you read the entire 117-page document if you're really interested.
Sure. Yeah, email it to me.
I will.
Tracy, I appreciated what you said about, some of the biblical basis around deacons preaching. And there are also times when the lessons lend themselves to the deacon preaching. And hopefully the priest in the parish is attuned to that. Cricket will remember we always had our deacon preach on the last Sunday of the year in year A, because that's where Matthew tells the story of the separation of the sheep and the goats. Feed the hungry, clothe the naked. Things like that. Yeah. I did have one of my deacons, without warning, wear a t-shirt that day when he preached, and it showed a picture of Jesus pointing his finger, kind of like Uncle Sam, and it said underneath, "Feed the poor or go to hell."
Oh no.
I thought it was hilarious. Not everyone did.
Maybe not everybody.
I just, when you were talking about biblical warrant for preaching too, it also occurred to me that St. Francis was a deacon and he preached regularly. He preached before he was a deacon, but he was in fact ordained a deacon. He was never ordained a priest, and he was a preacher.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good example.
what does the Lesser Feast and Fast say about Francis, the most beloved but least emulated saint?
Yeah, right, exactly. Right.
Yeah. So something that's interesting in the history, certainly Keith is familiar with this, as the Fund for the Diaconate keeps records, a lot of historical data about the deaconesses. And so, deaconesses have been involved in, a lot of things from, 1850s. And, one of the pieces that they have on the Fund for the Diaconate's website is kind of a compilation of a lot of deaconesses biographies. And Deaconess Anna Alexander from the Diocese of Atlanta, she was the first and the only African-American deaconess. And, she pretty much ran that whole congregation, so I think it would be really hard to imagine that she didn't preach, right? Like,
I think the last of the deaconesses died this past month.
Sister Priscilla Jean.
Yep.
Right. She was a part of the Community of the Transfiguration in Cleveland, Ohio.
Cincinnati, Ohio. Cincinnati.
Or Cincinnati, thank you. Yeah, and she served like in Navajo land and the Dominican Republic and Texas for a little while. And
Yep.
I'm trying to find out a little bit more about what she did here in Texas. And so yeah, it's a closing of an era. And we were talking about that in our board meeting for the Association for Episcopal Deacons about how much gratitude we have for the different waves of the diaconate that came before us, how kind of formative all those people's life and ministry has been for how we understand who deacons are in the Episcopal Church today.
Absolutely. Other participants in the conference, do you want to share something or ask a question to any of the panelists? I mean, my sense is how has it been for this assembled group to be able to get an invitation to preach from time to time? Some of you obviously have been doing it quite frequently, and others maybe not so much. What are the challenges you face? What are the things you would like to do differently or hope would be done differently?
See a few hands up.
Who's that? Go ahead.
So it looks like
Patricia, go ahead and unmute yourself and just go ahead and jump in.
I think Ken was first. Do you want to start?
Okay.
Except I have to find the unmute button.
You're there.
Here I am.
Yep.
Two questions to put on the table. One would be, are there what practical things and what practical approaches are there if in fact your priest says no, you're not going to talk about that this week? What are some next steps and next stages? And the other question might have to do with, are there particular festivals or places in the year's happenings that it makes sense for the deacon to in fact preach? I served under one priest who was very strongly emphatic that I should be the one to preach on Maundy Thursday with the washing of feet. And the other four priests that I've served under were very emphatic that that was not the deacon's turn to preach. Are there some particular days that it makes sense for the deacon to preach? So what do you do when the priest says no? And are there days when it makes good sense for the deacon to preach?
Well, I'll turn that over to the panelists. What do you have to offer for Ken?
Well, I would just say, like, if the priest says no, then you just don't do it. Right? But I mean, there may be an opportunity at some point to have a conversation about like the topic and to say, like, what would be a way that we could address this topic, and also just to kind of get a little more understanding of what the priest's concerns are, because I mean, there are always going to be factors that they're aware of and things that they're trying to balance and juggle that like I don't know about or have to be concerned with, and so I do want to just kind of like not try to make things just hard for them arbitrarily, right? Like, and so to kind of respect the things that they're trying to accomplish as well. And so like, if they say no, then it's just kind of like, okay, then I'll go a different direction, you know? But, you know, is there a way that we could talk about it or address it in some other context, you know?
I'm going to support that. You know, the priest has spiritual charge of the congregation, and so they do have that right. If there's a particularly prophetic moment, you feel you want to call it, take the risk. That's the risk, but I would be careful for sure. You know, in terms. Sorry, go ahead,
Sorry,
please.
Bishop. Go
Nope.
ahead, Bishop.
Nope.
I will do anything I'm told to do if you tell me why I'm doing it. And I will not do something if you tell me why I shouldn't do it. So I don't think it's unreasonable to ask why. Because as Bishop Stokes just said, there may be some underlying things that you're just not aware of in that moment.
Tracy said that.
And that to me that's why partnership in the gospel is a phrase that I like to hang on to, because if you're in partnership with the clergy in your church, then you're going to have conversation, and it's going to come with ease. And then, if I may respond to the other part of your question about when is the festival's best, I think that one of the things that we're striving for is uniformity in our church about the orders, most especially the order of the deacon. And I think some of this conflict where one priest says you absolutely should preach on Monday, Thursday, and two say no, that's not the time for you to preach. I think some of that comes from the lack of uniformity that we have achieved in the past. I think we're getting better at this, but there was a time, and I can only speak for the Diocese in New Jersey because this is where I live and have my being. There was a time when, you know, the diaconate was, what do we do with these people now? And now, you know, we're getting so much better at it, but we still have a little ways to go.
Okay.
I was just wanting to add, there also, it should be observed that there will be times when the priest will appreciate the deacon taking on the role of putting the hard thing out in front of the people.
Yeah.
You know, absolutely, you know, and the priest has the convenience of being able to say, that's the role of the deacon. They're exercising, telling the church what's going on in the world. You know, as in all things, you know, you have to think about how you're delivering the message. I mean, the problem today is too many people deliver the message in ways that people can't hear, right? You know, and I've been guilty of that. But I think, especially as the rector of a parish, I learned to acknowledge people would think differently about things, and sometimes to even articulate the other side of the question, even if I didn't agree with it, before I went wherever I went. You know, so just to recognize that there are different people out there with different perspectives is a key piece. But then, if you arrive at a gospel position, articulate it and articulate it clearly, and why, and how is it grounded in Jesus Christ. Baptismal covenant is pretty clear, as are texts like, Luke 4. Right?
Micah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think the prophets are, especially like, you know, Micah and Amos are good opportunities for deacon to have something to say. And it also might depend on the type of ministry that the deacon has. You know, if they tend to exercise more of a ministry of mercy, you know, works of mercy type thing, you know, or more of a prophetic voice type, you know, it just might depend, you know, on the deacon too. So it looks like Nicole and then Trisha had their hands up too.
Trisha and Nicole. Trisha, you want to go ahead? And then Nicole?
Sure. I just had a practical thing. I brought this up in my small group too, but the idea of preaching once a month is mind-boggling to me. Like when I had a full-time job, I had a very busy full-time job, and it takes like 10 hours to create a really good, what I thought was a good sermon. And so just doing that once a month seems like a gigantic ask of deacons, given that, our letter, it's supposed to be like 10 to 12 hours a week. So I just wanted to mention that, especially if, as we always say, we're trying to get younger deacons. If someone's like starting out in their career and has a young family, like once a month is a lot. It was in my letter of agreement. Mine was once a liturgical season. And in the short season, it was sometimes the other deacon. So.
There you go.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I have a full-time job in addition, and I have some caregiving duties. And so, yeah, like once a quarter, once every fifth Sunday, that works really well for me. Because I mean, like you said, if you have 10 hours that you're allocating over a week, or 15 maybe, and I have two hats, like I'm in a parish and then I have a role in the Deacons Association. You don't want to spend like your entire allocation for a week on just writing a sermon. It's certainly not like on a regular basis. Yeah.
Nicole, you wanted to offer something?
Thank you. I'm in one of those unique situations where our priest is not at the church for now. He had a health issue, and I'm kind of a rookie deacon I was ordained 6 months when he had to go out on sick leave for a stroke. But I have found that I just love preaching. Like sometimes I get so excited that I have to hold on to the edge because I feel like I'll float. Like I feel very like pumped up to share the word. Now, I'm not saying I'm always pumped up to write the sermons. I love doing all the research and stuff, but like pulling it all together can be so stressful to not give too much information and make it something that'll stir the heart. But I struggle with the fact that I was trained to preach like a deacon, but I'm in a church right now where there's no, I'm the stable, like the continuity for them. And so I have to preach, not always like a deacon, but I try to do like a deacon sermon each month and or weave it in with my regular sermons. I'm not sure why I shared that, but I wanted to mention Reverend Maria Sanso, her thesis on the work that she did. I got a sneak peek at that when she was getting her PhD. And if it's not published already, Maria, it should be, because it gave me insight into what it would be like to be a deacon right before I was ordained. And even newly ordained, you get to see like the vulnerabilities of deacons and the things that they struggle with. And I just encourage that to be shared more widely because it's very helpful. All right, thanks.
Well, I know that on the screen, there are a couple of people here who have had to step up when there has not been a priest available. And like my former colleague Cricket, who had to do that. And Clive is in a situation I know where he is the primary preacher. This does happen. Sally, you wanted to say something?
Sally's regular in that too.
Yeah.
Right? I want to tell you that's more and more. In the Diocese of New Jersey, we have 137 congregations and we have 89 active full-time priests.
Huh. How many congregations?
137.
And 89 full-time priests.
Yep.
Wow. So it kind of brings around a question. I mean, we're talking about some deacons, we're trying to get them an invitation to be able to speak at all. And some are taking on a pastoral role of leading a congregation. And Nicole highlighted some of that in terms of, not necessarily preaching a diaconal type sermon all the time. How do we balance this going forward? That's my question to everybody. Bishop, you wanted to say something about that?
Do I?
Were
you asking me? I didn't know.
Yeah, I thought you waved your hand.
I didn't, but I'm happy to say, I had a conversation with some of the folks on our committee on the priesthood and committee on the diaconate. I'm a strong upholder of the diaconate and of diaconal identity. I also, however, recognize that throughout the church's history, decisions have been made about people in orders based on the exigencies of the church and what the church's needs are. And there are times when we need to recruit deacons to be priests. And it might be, or to have a priest-like role. And it might be and by that I mean, there are times when they'll be in a temporary situation, or we're using them with priests. And in our diocese, we're doing affiliations where there are priest teams, clergy teams of priests and deacons, and the deacons have a much fuller role. We're compensating them for that too. But there are higher expectations, and a lot of times that blurs the line between diaconal function and priestly function. But again, that's the exigencies of the church. And I always believe that the deacon is going to be a deacon regardless. That's core identity, if you're called a diaconate. On the other hand, there are some people that we are actually saying who are deacons, we really want to ask you to consider whether you might be a priest and whether you should consider the priesthood, because we really could use you. And some of them are saying yes, and I think we need to support that as church, because the needs of the church are, there's a mutual ecology here. And it may be a sacrifice on the part of those folk, but it is for the larger good of the church.
Sally, you have something you wanted to say?
I just, in response to Nicole's story, I was a deacon about 6 months. The first time that the priest at St. John's went out on sick leave, he was gone from November until the week after Easter. And the second time, a year later, he was gone from January until after Easter. And then he retired, and we went 2.5 years in an elongated, prolonged search process. I was non-stipendiary for the whole of it. They certainly searched for supply priests, supply clergy to come in and be the priest. The first time Father Steve was out, the supply priests were, I called them priest du jour, and a couple of them were nursing home resident, or CRCC residents who had to get out right away because lunchtime was at 12 at the facility, and if they missed lunch, it was their big dinner of the week, type of a scenario. The second time he was out, recently retired priest of the diocese, Father David Laquintano, came and helped it. Wonderful. And when the priest retired, Father David was sort of our long-term supply. But because he was a retired priest and considered supply, he was not interested in vestry meetings, annual meetings, parochial reports, keeping the numbers straight in the book, performing funerals, and all of that fell onto me as a deacon. And then the bishop, our bishop here, asked me to help in an effort to conjoin 2 small parishes with 1 priest nearby, not far from St. John, St. George's in Pennsville. And I became yoked to those 2 parishes. And that did become stipendiary because I was working full time and I had to preach every single week because I was in one church or the other, opposite of where Father Will was. And I said, just as Tricia said, it's 10 hours worth of preparation or so, and largely Saturday. And really wasn't so much doing the deacon's customary. I could probably do that with my eyes closed at this point in time, from the liturgical standpoint, but preparing a meaningful sermon that said something that was worth preaching took time. So this is what Bishop Chip is saying. The role of the deacon is evolving into something that, frankly, it was never intended to be in my class, but that's a good thing. I'm not complaining. I'm just relating the history.
It's a reality. And again, I think we have a changing church. One of the things to also observe about this is that, I grew up in the Episcopal Church, and I grew up with the 1928 Book of Common Prayer. Every church I went to as a kid was a morning prayer parish. Eucharist was twice a month.
Once a month for me.
Yeah, I mean, that was just the norm. And with the Book of Common Prayer, 1979, which we began to use as a proposed book in 1976, it had that rubric in it that said the Eucharist, the Holy Eucharist, shall be the principal act of worship on the Lord's Day. It was not the principal act of worship on the Lord's Day for most of my childhood and teen years. Clearly, to make the Eucharist the principal act of worship on the Lord's Day means that we have to have enough priests to be able to celebrate. Well, we don't.
Right.
So what are we going to do? That's the jam that we're in right now. And the truth of the matter, too, is I have places where we could put 4 of our congregations in the same region together, and they still wouldn't be able to afford half a full-time priest. That's a fact.
I'm really tempted to say something about lay preaching, since that's what I do, but I'm not going to hold off on that.
There's another, that's why we morphed our school for deacons into a school for ministry, so that it would form people for vibrant lay ministries. And frankly, the model was pulled from my experience at the Mercer School of Theology when I was in my early years, because it used to be that the Mercer School of Theology prepared people for bivocational, late vocational priesthood.
Mhm.
That was a part of its mission, but also prepared people for lay ministry, vibrant lay ministry. And Southeast Florida also did the same. So I think we're going to see more of that as well. And I think COVID taught us that, in fact, there's a much more vibrant role for laity than we have been giving them.
Ken had his hand up here. And something you wanted to add?
No, I was going to ask or follow up with the bishop. So, Bishop, what happens when there aren't enough priests for Eucharist to formally happen? What happens in?
Right. I've authorized the deacons to do communion from the reserved sacrament. And there are places where that's happening every other week or something like that. One of the things that I've said in the customary that we've given them is that at least once a month, there needs to be a full celebration of the Eucharist with a priest. A supply priest has to be found to do that, to make sure that we understand what we're doing is not normal.
Interesting. John, you had something you wanted to ask.
Yes, and this is directed at the bishop, actually. So you said something that triggered the thought about stipendiary, non-stipendiary.
Yeah.
And it's my understanding that to be ordained a deacon, one assumes that that's going to be a non-stipendiary vocation, if you will.
Right.
So at what point, because of the commitment to the church, as far as sacerdotal responsibilities, or maybe not that, but other responsibilities, when does it turn into a different type of call where one is compensated for that? Can you speak to that?
What we have been doing is if we're in a situation where it's more than one congregation, and we are having the deacon be part of the full servicing as a member of that clergy team of the 2 congregations. We haven't done more than 2 yet, but of the 2, then because our expectation is they're going to be preaching every week and have that kind of pastoral support, that then becomes an instance where we just are automatically saying this requires stipend. And the level of that can go from a quarter time to half time to 3/4 time. It depends really on the deacon and their availability. Others of our deacons are in a more traditional 1 priest, 1 deacon congregational setting, and we're treating that as the non-stipendiary traditional model of the diaconate that was in place in the Diocese of New Jersey at this stage. We compensated the deacons that work for me at St. Paul's were compensated actually as full-time employees. So, there's no hard, fast rule. It's, but I agree with you that the norm has been non-stipendiary.
Tracy has some stuff she can add in this as well. She knows a lot of the dioceses and what they practice. Sorry, John, you wanted to follow up, but
Well, I just wanted a question about the acceleration of the transitional deacons.
Yeah.
Are you in New Jersey accelerating that process so that it's not a year?
Yeah,
anymore?
for sure. Yeah, we normally ordain them after 6 months.
6 months.
Tracy, you want to say something about other dioceses?
Yeah,
and what they
sure.
do?
There's a pretty wide range of practice, I mean, so I don't know if it could be generalized, but I mean, I kind of get the sense that dioceses that have had the vocational diaconate longer tend to have less kind of hard and fast rules about deacons are always non-stipendiary, and also like the church pension fund has made some changes in the recent years. And so there's a big range of what stipendiary can include. And so, there's a really wide range of that, but also something else that if you have an interest in, you might take a look at the, what are they called now? The Episcopal Parish Network, used to be called SEEP. We did a series of videos on the diaconate, the history, the present, and the future. And in the third video, a data analyst from CPG did some presentation about demographic and statistical trends in the ordination of deacons over time compared to the ordination of priests. And just kind of one of this was my sense, and I had some kind of concern about it sometimes when people are talking about, oh, with all the boomer priests that are retiring, like the deacons could fill in. And I'm like, I don't know for sure, but I think math is going to be a problem there, because there's like this many, priests that are retiring and this many deacons that exist, and the majority, like the large majority of deacons are already past retirement age, and so the number of like young deacons is pretty small, and a lot of them have jobs, and so, and I think we have to kind of figure out what that pipeline looks like for people to be able to access it in the first place. And then, I just kind of also, I feel some kind of concern about like, if the diaconate is a distinctive order, how helpful is it to take like, very many of those deacons and have them function as priests mostly, I mean, I know that like needs must at times, but I mean, I think it's like you were saying, Bishop Stokes, about like, do we have to have Eucharist every Sunday, everywhere, all the time,
Right. Well, first of all, we're clear that a deacon's not celebrating the Eucharist. So it's, we are making that distinction, and we're still clear about that. But I completely can acknowledge that what we're doing is blurring the lines. And, but it again is the challenge of the church right now. And the shortage of priests is no small thing either, which is why, again, in the Diocese of New Jersey, we have created a school for ministry where we hope we will generate more local ordinations of priests, late vocation, bivocational priests. The church is going to need to move in that direction. Right now, we think in the Diocese of New Jersey, it's our assumption that it takes about $250,000 of parish income to be able to afford a full-time priest, basically at the entry level, meaning coming right out of seminary without a lot of years of experience.
Wow.
You need about $250,000 of income to afford a full-time priest. Because a full-time priest can be over $100,000 package. Okay. Of our 137 congregations, 37 of them have $250,000 or more in income.
Wow.
That's a fact. So the facts are calling us to have to think creatively about how we're going to accomplish the ordained ministries of the church. And I think that's, we're trying to figure out how all of that will work. And also within the constraints of a prayer book that says, the Holy Eucharist shall be the principal act of worship on the Lord's Day, which again, we're kind of saying, well, we're not quite doing that, but people are getting communion.
Wow. There's been some interesting posts in the chat about what some other dioceses are doing or have done. Yeah, we're obviously in a stage of transition, and rapid transition. Other comments from our panelists or questions to them? John, again.
Sorry, I do have another question, and this is directed to Keith, who had spoken about a fund of the diaconate or for the diaconate in the diocese. And I'm just curious if he could tell us a little bit more about that.
The Fund for the Diaconate of the Episcopal Church is the successor organization to the Pension Fund for Deaconesses. When the church pension fund was created just before World War I, it was only for the boys. And General Convention said, well, please include the deaconesses. And the CPF said, no. So the women started their own fund. We stopped ordaining deaconesses in 1970, and the fund continued to support the remaining ones in their retirement. But by the late 80s, that had petered out. Pretty much, there are only maybe a dozen or so left. So they changed to become the Fund for the Diaconate and supporting any deacon in need. We recently went through some legal changes with the state of New York, and we're now allowed to give out grants to support persons pursuing the diaconate. If they've been admitted to a program and have a letter from their bishop, we will support up to $1,500 a year for tuition, psychological exam, travel, housing if they need it, if it's an overnight situation. We'll even take care of daycare or spousal care if they need somebody to take care of someone at home while they're in the formation program. But related to that, and I know this is getting off topic, we also did two surveys this year of deacons and then people in formation. And with help from the Church Pension Fund people, we estimate that there's about 360 people in formation for the diaconate in the church right at the moment. And according to our survey, which got, we had about 120 responses, so that was pretty good. Over half of them received no financial support from their diocese to enter into formation. You know, it was either they were paying for it themselves or their parish was helping them. I think, and I've got the numbers somewhere else, and we're going to be doing an article on this. I'm going to say less than 10% were being fully supported by the diocese in training.
Wow.
So not only are we looking for these people to take on pretty much non-stipendiary ministries, we're asking them to fund it themselves too. So if there's a lack of enthusiasm out there, that might contribute to it.
There you go. Tracy has put a couple things in the chat too. The link to the Fund for Deacons and a link to a formation fund in the Diocese of Pennsylvania for deacons as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. What is that other thing you posted, Tracy?
A while back, we started a committee within the Association for Episcopal Deacons called a Young Deacons Committee. And our first kind of gathering, we did some work kind of brainstorming what are some barriers to younger people choosing a vocation in the diaconate. And we identified, you know, just the ones that we were familiar with, right? From the, you know, discernment, kind of recruitment and discernment phase, the formation phase, and then like sustainability in ministry kind of phase. And then later on, we did some surveys and analysis of those results to kind of get a better picture of what people thought might be ways to address some of those barriers. And that's what the committee continues to do, is, look at some of those barriers and experiment with ways to kind of smooth out the path to, because so I had been ordained, I think 7 years when I attended that conference, and I met another deacon that was within 20 years of my age for the first time. And there were, I think, 7 of us there who were like 40s or younger, and all of us, it was this, none of us had ever met a person that was in our age group, and so we were wanting to, and interestingly too, all of us felt like the fact that we had ended up ordained was a total fluke. Like, how was this even possible? And so it's like, that's not maybe like the best kind of trajectory for sustainability. Like, if all of us feel it was a total fluke that we made it, so yeah.
Okay. We're getting close to the end of our time. I do want to say I've done a couple of these conferences with Tracy, and you're very fortunate to have as your leader somebody who knows so much about where the church is with the diaconate nationwide. And we appreciate your sharing that knowledge with us, Tracy.
Couple
Another,
hands up.
where's a hand? Oh,
Jerry.
Jerry. Got to unmute yourself.
She's canceling.
Okay.
Type it in the chat.
The joys of technology. And just post it in the chat. Okay. Mary Claire has sent a link as well in the chat to Education Fund for Diaconal Ministry and Priestly and Lay. So, anyone else with comments that they wanted to add to or share with all of us? We've gone far afield from the invitation to preach, which of course was expected. This is an opportunity for all of you to be able to talk with each other about what concerns you most. And I think that's happened. Here we go.
Well, I'm grateful all of you came out, but I have to also say, especially my Diocese of New Jersey deacons, God bless you. Thanks for the time. What a gift.
Jerry says, Diocese of New Jersey made it easier. Took me 10 years to start the ordination process.
Well, I was having trouble finding my mouse. I got it now. Basically, I think that we really need to publicize more what a deacon is, like somebody was saying in the chat, and they have made it easier for us to apply. It used to be only every 3 years, and it almost was like a magical unicorn that you could actually get through the process at the right time. But now it's easier, but it took a long time for us to get there.
There you go. Yep.
Nicole's hands up.
Nicole, yes.
Thank you. I was just gonna go back kind of to the preaching thing. Each week I go through a process of gathering information and stuff, but it's not always the same. And I was wondering, based on Reverend Smith's exegesis from day one yesterday, do you use kind of a very structured way every week, or when people are preaching that same exact those steps, or does it vary? I'm not sure if I'm.
No, you're just fine. It varies. There are different ways of doing exegesis. Just as I said, there's no one grand answer to any exegesis that you on any single passage. There is no format necessarily that can be proved one above another. Have you ever been in education for ministry? Well, then you know about theological reflection. A theological reflection on the text is an exegesis. Whatever you do to try to draw the meaning out without reading too much in yourself, but try to let the text speak to you and communicate to you, that's an exegesis. And the example I gave you is simply one. Simply one. There's a way of, one fun way of doing an exegesis that Kim Jackson from Atlanta talks about is that she says she imagines the people that are described in a scriptural story in today's setting. So instead of the laborers in the vineyard, you've got the migrant workers hanging around Lowe's waiting for somebody to hire them. That's an exegesis. You get the idea. It's a way of opening up the questions of the text in a way that brings them to our day. I hope that's helpful. Okay. Other comments that people may have? Well, thank you all very much. And let's thank our panelists especially for their willingness to step up and tell us a little bit about what their experience is, and for sharing your experiences and your questions and your comments and your challenges. We obviously are in a stage of transition, and we're going to continue to move through that. Our next stop is 3 o'clock at the breakout rooms that Meg will send us to for our preaching groups. And then at, I believe it's 5:30, let me check that to be sure. Yes, 5:30 for closing worship. And we'll gather as a whole group for closing worship. And then we'll be back at it tomorrow afternoon after everybody gets to go to church and work at church. Okay. See you all at worship at 5:30.